Alright, it's time for me to beat another dead horse by talking about Pokemon rivals. So, over the years, but especially in recent games, the quality of Pokemon rivals has been on the decline in the eyes of many fans. Many attribute this to the rise of friendly rivals, but as many others have pointed out, being nice isn't and shouldn't be used as an immediate marker of poor quality. In fact, rivals like N and Hugh are highly regarded despite being relatively well-mannered to the player, and their kind attitudes don't diminish the intensity we feel when battling them. The dichotomy between jerk rivals and friendly rivals is further challenged by Gladion, who starts off mean, mostly to Hau, but eventually develops into our ally. I guess you could argue that Gladion is more, edgy than mean, but that actually helps to illustrate my next point, which is that the jerk and friendly labels attributed to rivals are just fan constructs. They're just observations we've made about rivals, but they likely aren't being written with these categories in mind. Furthermore, trying to assign these labels to certain rivals can be difficult and at times a bit misleading. Take, for example, Marnie. Would it be accurate to call her a friendly rival? I mean, she is nice to the players, so she could qualify as one, but there are more accurate ways to describe her personality that don't really point to her being particularly friendly or mean, and in my opinion, this is why the friendly label fails to be a useful category in general. The characters that could be classified as friendly rivals are too diverse to reasonably be compared, and honestly the only reason this category exists in the first place is for jerk rivals to be superior to them. The jerk label itself is far less diluted, but it still suggests a similarity in importance and reception between its members that simply isn't there. I mean, just look at how Blue remains one of the most iconic rivals in the series, whereas Bede has only made a temporary impact on the fandom, even though he's arguably much more complex and more hostile than Blue was in the Kanto games. In fairness, he doesn't have years of exposure and nostalgia to back him up, but my point is that even though they're both jerks, that doesn't immediately put them on the same level. So that's my take on the whole jerk versus friendly rival thing, but now you may be asking, well, if that's not what distinguishes the good rivals from the bad ones, then what does? Well, most fans just create a new set of criteria, usually based on how competitive or well-written a rival is, or simply based on how challenging they are in battle. Unlike the paradigm between jerk rivals and friendly rivals, these criteria avoid boiling everything down to a single personality trait or character type. However, while I definitely respect these more dynamic and inclusive methods of evaluation, I still think they're heavily flawed because they place too much importance on the role of our rival as if they're solely responsible for carrying our relationship. Not enough importance is given to the writing that surrounds our rivalry, and to show you what I mean, I'll use Hop as an example. Oh, and for future reference, keep in mind that I haven't played all of these games, especially the first two generations. My analysis will mostly just be based on game quotes that I found on Bulbapedia, and the gaps in my knowledge are going to be filled by the general vibes that I get from the fandom, so just keep that in mind. Based on the above criteria, Hop should be a relatively good rival. He aspires to be a great trainer like his brother, and when he can't reach that goal, he goes through one of the most extensive character arcs of any rival. So not only is he highly motivated, we also see the highs and lows of him not being the protagonist that he thinks he is. And while he's often compared to Hau, this actually makes him a bit more like Hugh, because he sees himself as the hero of his own story. In my opinion, the weakest point of Hop's development is mainly just his decision to become a professor, since it kind of comes out of nowhere. However, at least he's able to resolve his inferiority to the player, unlike Caleb, Serena, and Hau, who all have similar family legacies but don't really end up excelling in any other categories. The stakes are undeniably high for Hop throughout the game, and he's far more emotionally complex than most of the rivals before him. But despite all of this great groundwork, I feel the need to ask, how is any of this significant to the player? I mean, don't get me wrong, it's an interesting story, but, we really aren't competing for the same thing. Hop is internally motivated to win because he wants to live up to the reputation of his champion brother, but the player's only reason for participating in the gym challenge is that Leon endorsed us, which is entirely external. Sure, that gives us the same end goal, but the amount of emotional investment we have in becoming champion is inherently lower than all of our rivals, even Marnie. More than anything else, I think this is the problem with most rivals, that their priorities are so divorced from ours, the rivalry ends up feeling incredibly one-sided. For contrast, just look at Hop's relationship with Bede. Much like the player, Bede is stronger than Hop, but unlike us, he actually has something to gain by becoming champion. In his case, it's his desire to live up to Chairman Rose's expectations that makes their relationship interesting, because his motivation parallels Hop's desire to live up to Leon. So at least from an outside perspective, if I had the choice to watch a story about Hop's rivalry with Bede instead of his rivalry with the player, I would go for Bede, because their relationship is just way more interesting. If I could make one change that would strengthen our rivalry with Hop, I would just make Leon our brother too. Hop's relationship to Leon is already the most personal reason any character could have to defeat the champion, so it just makes sense to project that same pressure onto the player. But on top of that, this specific characterization creates a scenario where we actually stand to lose something if Hop beats Leon and becomes champion instead of us. Specifically, our standing as the weakest trainer in our family would be highly visible because our brothers would literally be the two strongest trainers in the entire region. Consider that if Leon was actually able to beat us in the game, nothing about the player's life would change. We would just take the loss, continue being a nobody, and then try again next year. Like, no big deal. But if we're Hop and Leon's sibling, then we're constantly at risk of becoming a gigantic failure in the eyes of our family and the public, and Hop's continued running in the gym challenge is a threat regardless of how strong he actually becomes, because it's an embarrassment if we lose to him either way. Of course it would help if he was actually challenging to fight, but my point is that what makes a character a rival has less to do with a competitive personality or an especially well-written storyline, and more to do with actually being in the same competition in the first place. So, how did we get here? For all the criticism I've directed toward Hop, I feel like Sword and Shield does deserve some credit for at least trying to intensify each of our rivalries by making the gym challenge the main conflict of the game. It makes Sword and Shield a huge outlier among modern Pokemon games because although our goals are only superficially similar, we do ultimately share the same objective of becoming champion, and therefore we have something to actually compete over. By contrast, most Pokemon games focus more on stopping a criminal organization from harnessing the power of a primordial god, which typically results in our rivals getting sidelined because they just don't add any additional tension to the story. I'll explain why this is important later, but the funny thing is that it wasn't even always like this. Notably, Blue and Silver, the characters most often hailed as the best rivals, came from an era before legendary Pokemon were the focal point of the games. Of course, there were still evil teams running around causing trouble, but since Team Rocket never built up to anything as drastic or urgent as recreating the world or powering a massive death laser, the lower stakes allowed the player to devote more emotional energy to their rivals. In Blue's case, this meant he was able to play a far more integral role in the story than most rivals do. Apart from being the culminating battle of the Kanto games, Blue serves as a more personal antagonist to the player, in contrast to the largely interchangeable Team Rocket grunts. His abrasive personality is the reason most people find him memorable, but it's not just for show. It actually helps to move the story forward by motivating the player, which makes him incredibly difficult to remove from the story without altering the experience of the game, as evidenced by many fans' poor reception of Trace. Compare that to someone like Bede, who, despite being just as mean and arguably more complicated than Blue, could easily be replaced by Oleana or another Macrocosmos employee without changing much of the story because the game doesn't rely solely on him to push the emotional narrative forward. Blue may not be a particularly complex character, nor the most evil antagonist we face, but he has a role and he fills it well, which is only possible because Team Rocket isn't complex enough to overshadow his influence on the story. Team Rocket remained a relatively simple threat in Generation 2, so Silver retained most of the same benefits that Blue had, but a few notable differences in his situation serve as indicators of where rivals would be headed in the future. Firstly, the role of champion and rival was split between him and Lance, which isn't inherently a bad thing, as we'll see later, but it did mean that Silver was slightly less important, because he was no longer the final match. Honestly, it was probably done so Silver wouldn't feel like a rehash of Blue, and for Lance to actually be the final challenge this time around, but it was still a split in the player's attention, even if it's just a minor one. Secondly, Silver was written to be significantly meaner and more explicitly evil than Blue as a way to raise the stakes, which isn't a trend that would continue with rivals specifically, but would instead manifest in the escalation toward legendary conflicts. This leads directly into Generations 3 and 4, but before I get into the legendary stuff, I first want to lay out how Silver works differently from Blue, because I don't think their success necessarily boils down to both of them being jerks. Primarily, what I think separates Silver from Blue is the ideology attached to his meanness. While Blue's personality is used specifically as a tool to emotionally invest the player in the game, I feel like Silver's hostility is more so just a way to highlight his ideology. Characterizing him as an angsty, power-obsessed kid is just the most effective way to convey his belief that kindness and friendship are weaknesses. But even if he was somehow nicer or a more level-headed character like Gladion, we'd probably still feel the need to beat him because the basis of this entire franchise is built on our desire to befriend and inhabit the world of Pokemon. Even before friendship became a method of evolution, our Pokemon only grew because we cared enough to nurture their strengths, so it's only natural that we'd want to prove Silver wrong. What I find very interesting about this rivalry is how it must have been especially pronounced at the time of Gold and Silver's release, because it was at a time when the fanbase was new and at its most passionate. But I think this type of ideologically driven rivalry could potentially fit in any game, because it essentially creates conflict by cutting to the core of the franchise's appeal and then rejecting it. And all of this isn't to say that personality counts for nothing. Rather, I think approaching rivals this way just allows them to have a more diverse range of personality traits, because it doesn't require them to behave a certain way in order to be effective the way that blue needs to be. But I'm pretty sure the main reason we don't see more rivals following this ideological mold is just that it probably is really hard to find new angles to attack the fanbase from. But with that tangent out of the way, I can finally get back to discussing how conditions that arose in Gen 3 would go on to impact rivals going forward. Most notably, Gen 3 shifted focus toward legendary Pokemon as a feature of the narrative, and while this added a lot more complexity to the games by increasing the scope and urgency of the evil teams, in addition to enriching the world, it also meant rivals had to start competing more for the player's attention than with the player themselves. Like, our to-do list is basically catch legendary Pokemon, defeat criminal organization, become strongest trainer in the region, beat next door neighbor. Like, clearly one of these things is not like the other. This struggle to impact the story was only compounded by the fact that champions had become separate entities in the previous generation, but the final nail in the coffin, specifically for Jerk rivals, was that Silver had already served as like the most antagonistic rival we could possibly get. He stole his starter Pokemon, regularly harassed and insulted the player, and basically served as the antithesis to the phrase, the bond between people and Pokemon. It's hard to make a character meaner than that. Even if the writers could escalate the animosity of future rivals, I feel like the Jerk trend would be impossible to maintain without inevitably oversaturating them, the way that friendly rivals are oversaturated now, and they would just kind of come off as a cheap imitation of what came before. So taking all this into consideration, I feel like it's completely understandable why Jerk rivals fell out of favor, at least for a time. However, that still doesn't explain why the writers feel compelled to continue inserting rivals into the games, even when they clearly aren't needed. I mean, I understand that in-universe we'd inevitably run into trainers that want to use this as a test of strength, but at their core, rivals are simply one of many narrative tools that are designed to get the player emotionally invested in the game. If there are enough things keeping our attention, there's no need to add another. Rivals add a more personal conflict that rewards the player for learning the game's mechanics and making good choices, but whether or not this subplot is gratifying completely hinges on whether or not we care about beating these characters in the first place. So how do we make the player care about beating their rival? Well, I think there are two ways, either by characterizing the player in-universe or by provoking the player directly. The first method is basically just getting us into character for roleplay, kind of like the scenario I described where Leon is our brother, whereas the second method is about projecting our real-life emotions onto our character, which is basically how our rivalries with Blue and Silver work. There are a few other rivalries built around the second approach that I'll get into later, but I think the problem people have with most rivals after Gen 2 is that they don't really utilize either method. This issue is perhaps best exemplified by the idea popularized in Gen 7 that we're the rival to How. When you think about it, this is kind of a funny sentiment because it's technically true in every generation. Like, even Blue and Silver gave their best efforts to surpass us, so treating that aspect of our current rivalries like it's revolutionary is pretty ridiculous. However, the implication behind this idea that our rivalry with How only goes one way is basically true, and it's not because he's friendly or because he chooses the weaker starter, but because he's the only one that actually stands to gain something from our relationship. To put it another way, if How pulls ahead of us, that means he's one step closer to matching the strength of his grandfather, but when we pull ahead of How, so what? Like, exactly what goal are we working toward where beating How is a mark of progress? The recent wave of rival hate seems to have started with How, but this is basically the dilemma rivals have been facing for years. Wally, Barry, Charon, Caleb, Serena, and the Sword and Shield rivals all have some goal that requires them to challenge the strongest trainer they know, which is usually us, but the battles aren't as high stakes for the player because we don't share their aspirations. I don't want to say that all these characters and their stories are necessarily boring or even poorly told, because most of them actually have decent development, and the praise for that is well deserved. But the player's lack of internal motivation means that our relationships with these characters are incapable of producing the type of rewarding mutual conflict that a rivalry is uniquely qualified to facilitate. Now, with that in mind, there are two notable exceptions to this trend. I've noticed that Hugh and Gladion have generally been accepted not just as good characters, but also as good rivals, despite basically being on our side, like their contemporaries. I assume this is partly due to them fitting more closely with the type of aggressive personality that we expect of a rival, but I think the more important aspect of their characters is their motivation to stop their game's evil team. While it's not uncommon for rivals to join the fight against the evil team, Hue and Gladion's particular fixation on Team Plasma and Lusamine is unique in that it allows their primary goals to align with the players for once. The problem with most rivalries is that our desire to become stronger pretty much only comes from the structure of the game. The story needs a conclusion, so we end the game by challenging the strongest trainer in the region, but rarely do the games explain why the player wants to become strong, let alone stronger than a random kid. By contrast, our rivalries with Hue and Gladion are built on a mutual desire to protect our friends and Pokemon, which needs no explanation since this franchise is built on our attachment to these creatures. We innately care about stopping the evil teams before they harm our loved ones, so rather than establishing a separate narrative like Blue and Silver, Hue and Gladion instead assimilate into a story we're already invested in. Though we may not necessarily be excited to defeat Hue and Gladion themselves, our battles with them still feel meaningful and important because they serve as preparation for the upcoming battles against the evil team and their leader. Okay, so I think that's basically all of the rivals. What the fuck is this? And in Friends. Okay, so when I said there were only 2 exceptions to the one-sided / friendly rivalry trend, I was lying. There's one more outlier, it's N. N is a very interesting case because he basically takes notes from all the mutual rivalries I mentioned before and employs their methods for success simultaneously. Like Hue and Gladion, his story is combined with the evil team and legendary plot, but he takes it a step further by effectively replacing the champion battle as well. Because all these plot points are combined, this means N has the player's undivided attention for most of the game, and it gives him an integral role in Black and White's story, mainly serving to make the central conflict more interesting, similar to Blue. So although Ghetsis is the one organizing Team Plasma's activity in both Black and White 2, N's removal from the sequels is substantial enough to result in a radically different experience, though in this case that's not really a bad thing. But anyway, a lot of the intrigue that N generates for the story of Black and White comes from the way his separatist worldview contrasts with the players. Like Silver, N's ideology suggests that there's something inherently wrong with the way most trainers interact with their Pokemon, and again, since this series is built on our desire to bond with Pokemon, that puts us fundamentally at odds with one another, both in-universe and in real life. It certainly helps that our rivalry is centered around an ethical dilemma that has plagued the series since its inception, and that the stakes are especially high, but the fact that there are stakes for the player at all is what cements this as a good mutual rivalry, and challenges our worldview just as much as we change his. So even though we ultimately defeat him, it doesn't feel like we exist solely to spur his character development. Additionally, since N's goals are already pretty transgressive, there's no need for him to act mean or annoying as a way to further provoke the player, so instead he's able to adopt a more sympathetic and mysterious persona that actively encourages our opposition. So basically, he's self-righteous either way, but the way he expresses this self-righteousness is tonally very different. And of course, N differs from every rival before or since in a way that adds an extra layer of drama to the story, which is the entire point of a rivalry, at least on a narrative level. N is a remarkably good example of a rival done really, really well, so it's honestly very strange that a lot of people don't think of him as one. Hell, I didn't even think of him as a rival until recently, but since our entire relationship is about testing each other over the course of the game, it's kind of hard to argue otherwise. Besides, by this point it's not unprecedented for rivals to also be a part of the evil team like Gladion, and even as early as Gens 1 and 2, Blue and Silver function simultaneously as antagonists and rivals, because they certainly weren't our allies. N may not be aggressive, but neither are most modern rivals. He doesn't have a starter Pokemon, but plenty of rivals don't. And he's an adult, but so are Clara and Avery. His journey starts at roughly the same time as ours, and we battle him about as much as the average rival, if not more, so I don't think there are many reasons he shouldn't be considered a rival outside of superficially not seeming like one. If you have any arguments against this, I'd be interested to read them, but to really drive my point home, I'd like to use no-sided rivalries as a point of comparison. Now in practice, no-sided rivalries aren't rivalries at all. They're functionally just friendships with no competitive angle whatsoever. These characters don't have any apparent motives that would conflict with the players, and as far as I can tell, they only resemble rivals in the sense that they battle us more than once, and they share superficial qualities like being the player's age or having a starter Pokemon. Brenton, May, Bianca, Shauna, and Tierno all fall into this category, along with Trevor and Hal, whose goals barely factor into the story, but the funniest thing about these rivals is that I'm pretty sure some of them aren't even referred to as such, whether in-game or in promotional material. In fact, a lot of them don't even care for battling that much and only seem to do it out of obligation as a Pokemon trainer. it makes me wonder why they couldn't just be non-battling NPCs like Lucas, Dawn, and Lily. But the point is, if these characters are allowed to count as rivals despite nothing about them suggesting that they are, then N should qualify as a rival no problem. With that being said, I don't mean to just trash all these friend characters. Bianca, for example, undergoes a great deal of character development to discover what she wants to do with her life, and this plot actually resolves by the end of the game when she decides to become Professor Juniper's assistant. Honestly, it's kind of funny how her story is basically a truncated version of Hop's arc, but it still effectively conveys a personal narrative about self-discovery and acknowledging your strengths and weaknesses, which is thematically powerful, especially in conjunction with Sharon's character arc. By contrast, Hao undergoes very little development, but he does a good job of rounding out Sun and Moon's cast due to his chemistry with the other characters. Some may find him annoying, but I think he perfectly fills his role as the chill optimist that balances out Lily and Gladion's more serious personalities. I mention all this to illustrate that friend characters can be good, just in ways that are completely divorced from them being any kind of competitor. To reiterate, these characters barely have a reason to fight us in the first place, so their main contributions are to the game's themes and character dynamics. At most, they're just friends that happen to battle us sometimes, and because of that, I think it'd be more appropriate if we started comparing them to support characters like Rei and Akari, instead of rivals like Hugh and Hop. In fact, for a very direct comparison to Rei and Akari, I'd specifically like to point out Brendan and May, because despite being identified as rivals by the fanbase, they primarily function as a friend and guide to the player, in addition to being the professor's assistant. This makes both pairs of characters very similar, and they are about as good as each other, but there is one major difference that separates Brendan and May from Rei and Akari, and that is the need to split their screen time with another character. This detail is pretty inconsequential for most of the game, but it does impact our final battle on Victory Road, where we fight Wally instead of Brendan and May. This does make sense, since Brendan and May are just researchers, whereas Wally's character arc is all about proving how strong he's gotten over the course of his journey. However, because we haven't battled Wally enough to build up to this moment, and Brendan and May's battles just kind of stop and they don't lead to anything, both of their stories end up feeling incomplete. This is mostly remedied in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, where Brendan and May get a post-credits battle to bring our journey full circle, while Wally gets more dialogue to flesh out his character. But even then, I'd probably give him Brendan and May's battle on Route 119 just to show more of his progress. I'm sure the writers simply wanted to differentiate the Gen 3 rivals by subverting expectations set by the previous two rivals, and the way this hinders the characters is pretty minimal, so none of this is of any real importance. I just felt the need to establish how challenging it can be to juggle two rivals before segueing into the X and Y friend group, because I think a lot of their problems similarly stem from the difficulty of managing multiple characters. The intention behind making such a large group in the first place likely came from the idea, represented by X and Y's title, that people with completely different worldviews would inevitably intersect somewhere, like lines on the X and Y axes. From this perspective, it makes complete sense why the writers would try to craft a sizable friend group with wildly divergent goals. However, while this is a cute concept, they come off as extremely shallow because the games don't dedicate nearly enough time to each character's individual development, which undermines the entire group dynamic they're aiming for. Instead of being one-dimensional lines that intersect, the X and Y friends act more like disparate points on a graph that never intersect and have zero dimension. This is best represented by Trevor and Tierno, who are both so single-mindedly dedicated to their goals and so thoroughly uninterested in each other's goals that it's a mystery how they're the closest friends in the group. I mean, they're the ones that are hanging out with each other constantly. Neither of them makes any meaningful progress toward their dreams, nor do they gain an appreciation for each other's differences. They just constantly reiterate how badly they want to fill the Pokédex and form a Pokemon dance team, even though it's completely irrelevant to the story, and literally no one else in the group cares. It's just kind of disappointing, because Trevor and Tierno's goals could be interesting in other games, but in X and Y they're completely pointless. Like, it just does not relate to anything in Kalos, or they could easily be cut, replaced, or merged with one of the other two friends, and since we encounter them as a part of the group most of the time anyway, it's not like there's much of a reason for them to be separate characters. In fact, Tam Valley Productions did replace them in his hypothetical Pokemon Z video series, and while I find it strange that he had us rely on a bunch of adults in a franchise that mostly serves as a fantasy where kids can travel without supervision, I appreciate that the characters replacing the X and Y friends actually contributed to the story. The fact that the X and Y rivals are supposed to be a friend group is especially frustrating because the generations directly before and after this one were able to strike a good balance between individual and collective screen time. So we know the writers are capable of weaving multiple characters into the story, they just didn't do it this time. The only exception to this is Shauna, because we actually get to spend time alone together, which allows us to learn more about her as an individual, and to share moments where we naturally develop our friendship rather than being forced into this group. Mind you, she's still not a particularly good character. In fact, she readily admits that she's just goofing around and nothing we do together actually contributes to the overall narrative. But since her goal was to make memories with us, I'd still argue that she's the most accomplished member of the X and Y friend group. It certainly wasn't Caleb or Serena, because they just wanted to be special in some undefined capacity. And by the end of the game, they realized how trivial it was to worry about that all along. Like, they didn't change career paths or prove to be good at anything else. They just confirmed that their entire journey was pointless. So I have no idea what character development they think they had. But anyway, I think future games can avoid X and Y's redundant rival problem so long as they keep friend characters to a minimum, since you really only need one character to hand out items, advice, and encouragement. Splitting that support role among multiple characters just reduces the narrative utility of each friend, because the amount of useful things they can do in the story is finite, whereas mutual and one-sided rivals can potentially be more effective in numbers. A pretty good example of this is actually the Sword and Shield rivals, because for all their problems, the fact that they're so numerous helps to highlight and intensify the scale of the gym challenge. But aside from keeping their numbers low, it's also helpful to just give each friend a side story like Shauna, and to make sure they have different priorities whenever we do meet as a group, like how. This is useful for rivals in general, but it's especially important for friend groups to show that they're individuals and not an interchangeable hive mind. Because what I really want to emphasize is that these characters' greatest flaw wasn't exactly that they were nice and boring, but that they were all nice and boring. But if the writers of X and Y did a better job of distributing their screen time and stuff, they could have at least been more fleshed out. Yeah. Sorry I spent so long trying to, make a line between rivals and friends. I'm not trying to invalidate anyone's attachment to these characters, I just think it's misleading to categorize them as rivals when they just literally aren't competing with us. This distinction is really only important for semantic reasons, because if we categorize every character that battles us multiple times as a rival, it potentially includes characters that clearly shouldn't be labeled this way, like Professor Sycamore or Dulcin Soliera. However, the other reason I don't want to lump them together is that these friend characters skew the overall perception of rivals. We start to think they're all friendly pushovers, even though most of the one-sided rivals are competitive and have very different personalities. Additionally, since I've already criticized the dichotomy between jerk rivals and friendly rivals as an unhelpful way of analyzing these characters, I just kind of want to avoid ideas that reinforce that framework. Difficulty. So, up until now, I've mostly been focusing on the characterization and writing surrounding the rivals, but now it's finally time to discuss the other major complaint people have had about recent rivals, which is that they've become too easy. Honestly, this part is a lot harder to dispute, because it's kind of true. The primary rivals for the past 2 generations have picked the starter that's weak to ours, the attempts at balancing their teams haven't been consistent, and starting in Generation 6, some of our rivals' Pokemon don't even have complete movesets by the end of the main story. These problems aren't, that deep and could easily be fixed, but the deliberate effort to weaken our rivals just seems like part of the larger trend to make the games easier and more accessible to younger players, which means we probably won't get harder rivals anytime soon. But with that in mind, I do still want to analyze some of the less obvious factors hindering our rivals' difficulty, because people tend to miss them. And also, when you're this deep into a YouTube video, you try to be as thorough as possible. The first thing I want to address is the multitude of team options available to the player near the beginning of the more recent games, because while it makes team building easier for us, it kind of makes things harder for our rivals. As the most recent example, by the time we enter Galar's Route 2, we've already encountered several bug and flying types to counter Hop's Grookey, Choodle and Arrokuda can be fished up to defeat Scorbunny, and Lotad, Seedot, and Yamper can easily dispatch Sobble. These, in addition to our starter, make it absurdly easy to handle Hop's strongest Pokemon for the rest of the game, and it only gets easier once we access the wild area, where there are a variety of fighting types to take care of his Wooloo, on top of all the Pokemon that can beat Marnie before we even meet her in Motostoke. Contrast all that with Black and White, where we don't encounter a single fighting type for Charon's Purloin or Bianca's Lillipup until we reach the second gym, at which point they immediately get Pokemon to deal with fighting types in subsequent battles. While none of this really impacts the long-term difficulty of our rivals, since, they're eventually going to have to account for variations in our team anyway. I'm trying to illustrate from a storytelling perspective how the availability of Pokemon can diminish tension very, very early on in the story. I mean, part of the reason Whitney is so hard is that we have very limited options to deal with her, and I assume that Nuzlocke and Monotype runs are challenging for very similar reasons. In any case, a similar concept applies to rivals that choose the weaker starter, because it immediately communicates that they'll be easy opponents in battle. In fact, the first rivals to do this, Bianca and Shauna, were both written to be relatively weak friend characters, rather than like the main rival. But what's interesting to note is that the first characters to do this overall weren't even rivals in the first place. We never battle Lucas or Dawn in the original Diamond and Pearl, and I can't help but think that the writers only gave them the weaker starter because they realized how weird it was that the final starter had been left completely unused for like 3 generations. In Black and White, giving the weaker starter to Bianca also serves like a thematic purpose in addition to being important for her characterization, but by X and Y it seems more like the writers just do this to tie up loose ends. And like, you know, that's fine. No one seems offended that Lucas, Dawn, Bianca, and Shauna have weak starters because they aren't supposed to be our primary rivals. However, by Gen 7 I think the writers got worried about being a little bit too predictable, and that's why they decided to give Hao, and later Hop, the weaker starter. This is pretty disappointing for our main rivals, because like I said before, it signals that they'll be easy to beat, but I think a lot of people overlook the fact that the stronger starter still gets used. It's just for the championship battles against Professor Kukui and Leon. I still think this is kind of a flawed setup, since the payoff to this decision only comes at the very end, and we're stuck battling an inherently weaker trainer for most of the game, but I will at least say that it is an interesting attempt to subvert expectations. Besides, if my guess about the writers not wanting to be predictable is correct, then this trend probably won't go on for much longer, and if Nimona turns out to be the only rival in Scarlet and Violet, then we can probably count on her not taking the weaker starter. On that note, it's worth pointing out that the games only began handing out all the starters once they started featuring multiple rivals to give them out to. Of course, there were still multiple rivals in Gen 3 as well, but it didn't really become a trend until Gens 5 and 6 solidified this practice of giving the last starter to one of our rivals. Consequently, this has meant that pacing our rivals' progress has become much more complicated because in addition to needing more character development, as discussed earlier, we also need to track each trainer's journey consistently enough that we remember their previous growth. Of these games, Black and White probably achieves the most balanced distribution of screen time since each rival gets roughly the same number of battles and they each grow at a consistent rate. But this is only possible because the game alternates regularly between Sharon, Bianca, and N, and so despite having the highest total number of rival battles, it doesn't feel that way because we're never stuck battling the same character for too long, which helps to keep things fresh. And even if you don't count N as a rival, Sharon and Bianca still get roughly the same amount of screen time by like alternating throughout the game. I don't get why, but this is just something that the other games with multiple rivals really struggle to accomplish because they spend too much time focusing on one rival while leaving the secondary rivals to be spread thin across our entire journey. The most obvious case of this is Shauna, Trevor, and Tierno, but it also applies to Wally and Marnie, whose battles are so few and far between that we can't reasonably use them as a point of comparison for our own progress, because there are just huge chunks of their development that we don't see. It's kind of like that arc in Steven Universe where Steven and Connie have a falling out, but Connie's side of the conflict is handled completely off-screen. Gladion and Bede make it out a bit better, but because Gladion's introduction is delayed and Bede's removal from the gym challenge comes halfway through the game, they aren't nearly as consistent as their peers, who we battle regularly. To be fair though, we actually battle Hao and Hop about as many times as Blue and Sharon, so the real reason their battles feel oversaturated is likely just tied to the overall pacing of their games. Hop's battles in particular should feel about as frequent as Charon's, because it's like 3 rivals and 10 routes across the whole game, but I think the short and linear design of Galar's routes, the scarcity of landmarks, and the utter lack of things to do in the major cities besides challenging the gyms is what makes the time between our battles fly by incredibly fast. Additionally, because we fight Hao and Hop so much more consistently than the other rivals, I think it just really draws attention to how we could be fighting those characters instead. But in short, I think things shake out as like 2 to 3 battles isn't enough for a journey that spans 8 gyms because it doesn't give us enough time to like see the progress and like be consistently measuring ourselves against each other. 7 to 8 battles can be overwhelming, especially in conjunction with infrequently fought secondary rivals, but somewhere around 5 battles seems to be the ideal, since they can occur at like roughly every other gym, and most single rivals sit comfortably within this range. Okay, moving on to miscellaneous stuff I couldn't fit into the rest of my analysis. I got kind of lazy, so this part's just in bullet points. I didn't know how to structure this. It's just a bunch of random thoughts, basically. Since Wally is an underdog, we really should have battled him more to see his growth, because the most interesting part of an underdog story is watching them try to beat the odds. However, while it's important to check Wally's progress because of his yet unproven strength, I think the opposite holds true for Marnie, since she already has tons of vocal supporters. Team Yell constantly hypes her up, and that's like the entire point of them, so I think it'd actually be kind of interesting if instead we just didn't battle her until the semifinals, because it's kind of like the treatment that a champion would get, and I feel like that would kind of increase the hype around her. Marnie is already pretty mysterious and aloof, so imagine if we like spotted her in the gym lobbies as the competition started to thin out over the course of the game, and then like we're just waiting to see if she's really as strong as Team Yell says she is. And I feel like that would be kind of an interesting way to build tension between us, especially once we learn that her brother is a gym leader. Of course, we can still learn that she's a nice person at the end of the day, but since Marnie arguably has the least compelling motives of the Sword and Shield rivals, because like nothing is at stake if she loses, she'll just become a gym leader, I think handling her this way would be a good way to set her apart. Incidentally, I think it also would have been interesting if Wally had made it into Sword and Shield, because a competition with stakes that high is like the perfect setting for an underdog like him, but also it would kind of help to bring in a more grounded and less prestigious character for the player to compare themselves to. Barry is one of the harder rivals to pin down because although he's very motivated to become stronger, we don't actually know why until the post-game of Platinum. That's not a knock on his character since he still has a broad motivation, I just think it's kind of funny. Like apparently in Pokemon Masters it's revealed that he keeps fining people so that he can afford to build his own battle tower where he can fight his dad, but this is not clear in the original Diamond and Pearl. Similarly, Sharon strives to be stronger, but when Alder asks him why, he doesn't seem to have an answer. Like, again, that's not a bad thing, it's just funny, but, like, he could have just said, oh, I've always, like, really admired trainers, I've always thought it was, like, a cool career path or whatever, or he could have been like, oh, I'm just a huge fan of you, Alder, but, like, instead he's just like, well, what else is there? It's just so funny to me that, like, he feels very strongly about becoming the champion, but he has not considered at all why he wants to do that, and I'm just like, dude... Well, you've been waiting for this your whole life and you don't even know why you want to do it. That's like you become a doctor and they're just like, so why did you want to become a doctor? Did you want to like save lives or like did you want the money or something? And he's just like, I don't know. I think it's interesting that all three rivals in Black and White go through a journey of self-discovery where they like consider or reconsider what they want in life. Since they're all changed by the player's influence, it really does convey Black and White's overall message of unity over separation, and how communication leads to change. Oh god, I've been waiting for this one. Let me get it. Come on. N seems like the type of guy to say really deep stuff in a slow and calm voice, but canonically he speaks really, really fast, and I think that's really funny. Okay, this is gonna be me trying to like read quotes from N as fast as I can. But I have no right to be the hero, acting like you understand. Up till now we've been fighting each other over our beliefs, yet despite that, why? I want to talk to you about something. It's about when I first met you in Accumula Town. I was shocked when I heard what your Pokemon was saying. I was shocked because that Pokemon said it liked you. It said it wanted to be with you. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't believe there were Pokemon that liked people, because up until that moment, I'd never known a Pokemon like that. The longer my... Oh my god, this is really hard. Okay. The longer my journey continued, the more unsure I became. All I kept meeting were Pokemon and people who communicated with one another and helped one another. That's why all I kept meeting were Pokemon and people who communicated with one another and helped one another. That was why I needed to confirm my beliefs by battling with you. I wanted to confront you hero to hero. I needed that more than anything. There's no way a person like me, someone who understands only Pokemon... No, actually I didn't understand them either. No way I could measure up to you. When you had met so many Pokemon and were surrounded by friends, the champion has forgiven me. What I should do now is something I'll have to decide for myself. So, like, just imagine every single line that N says, but he says it, like, at that speed, because that's canonically how he's supposed to sound. This is also kind of an irrelevant thing, but I just think it's funny. Like, I understand most of N's team, or the legendary dragons don't need explanation, and neither does his Zoroark. I feel like for the Unovan fossils, they're just supposed to be like rare Pokemon whose ancient powers he's unlocked, and that's kind of like, it fits the theme of what he's doing, but also they're like counterparts to each other, so that's another point in their favor. His Kling-Klang is an especially fitting choice due to N's affinity for motion mechanics and formulas as expressed at the Ferris wheel. I feel like the only choice that really trips me up is his Vanillux? My best guess is that they wanted something with useful ice coverage, but maybe it was chosen to represent New York City in general, since the Castelia cone is supposed to be modeled after a Vanillite, so they just want to have, like, something that represents New York being owned by him? I don't know. If you have ideas for what should replace N's Vanillux in the inevitable remakes, comment below. My suggestion would be a poison Pokemon, since it's the only other type without a type specialist in this region that isn't already represented on his team, the others being Rock and Steel. But I don't think Scolipede, Garbodor, and Amoonguss really fit him, so alternatively there are still a handful of Pokemon that go completely unused by any major character, so I don't know, maybe he could use like a Basculin or Darmanitan, Cinccino, Sawsbuck. It could be a couple of things. I don't get why Hugh didn't just own his sister's Purloin instead. Like, his sister isn't a character that we know or care about, so it would have just made more sense if the Purloin just belonged to him. I guess it does show that he cares about people other than himself, but I think the real reason he didn't take it is that adding a Liepard to his team would have made it a bit too similar to Charon's team from Black and White. By the way, if I had to choose a template for future rivals to emulate, I'd probably just use Hugh and Gladion as a blueprint because they just mesh well together with like the evil team plot that most Pokemon games have. I feel like it's really important that we just integrate the rivals into a core part of the Pokemon formula, because that's just the easiest way for them to remain valuable and relevant parts of the story. Oh god, this one's gonna be really long. I might be wrong, but I feel like a lot of attention was drawn to Kalos' star shape during X and Y's promotion, and I kind of wish they had done something with that, since 5 is kind of a recurring number in those games. Specifically, I wish each rival just had a side quest in, like, one corner of the region or something. So, for example, we could go to Glittering Cave with Trevor instead of Calum and Serena, so that he can fill his Pokedex with rare fossil Pokemon, and then he can use one of the Kalos fossils instead of Aerodactyl on his team. In general, I'd like it if he used rare or otherwise like collectible Pokemon like Gourgeist or his Florges, instead of just using Raichu, because like we've seen that on a handful of people's teams. It seems kind of pointless to do that. Like, he could have at least had like Dedenne or something. He could have had like the regional Pikachu clone instead of just a normal evolution of Pikachu. It just seems kind of unnecessary. Tierno could practice his dance moves in Reflection Cave, but if he doesn't do that, then he could just tag along with us when we visit the Lost Hotel, because if he's going to exist in Kalos, then he may as well integrate a feature like roller skates into his dance routine. Shauna already has a side quest, but I do think she should be the one to participate in the multi-battle on Route 7, just to show that she's more open to a casual battle than Calum and Serena. However, I also think it'd be interesting if her observant nature started to make her feel like a third wheel, and then like when we battle her on Route 19, she's unexpectedly powerful. That way, it can feel like her observation skills aren't going to waste, and she can experience a moment of self-realization with her friends, where she's like, oh, I'm not just a third wheel, I like offers something useful to the group, and then, you know, we can have a little friendship moment at that time. And then since Shauna and Trevor took some moments from Calum and Serena, they can just take the first rival battle in Aquacord and fight alongside the player in Frost Cavern instead. The first battle shows that they're eager to set themselves apart, while the team up in Frost Cavern just feels more fitting because they're stronger than Trevor, and it's like later in the game, so they may as well just be the one who's doing it. I feel like story-wise, they can like distance themselves from the group more over time until they realize that they shouldn't have to face everything alone, so that when we encounter Lysander closer to the end of the game, they can be the one to like tell him off for trying to play God instead of reaching out to people. But other than that, I think the most essential change to Calum and Serena's character should have just been the incorporation of their parents into their motivations, since it's mentioned early on that they're strong trainers. Perhaps they could pressure Calum and Serena to live up to their legacy, but it would also kind of make sense if Calum and Serena just decided on their own that they wanted to stand out. But either way, we should have met their parents to see what they need to live up to, and then we could have like a bonding moment where we try to beat them together. Otherwise, Calum and Serena could have just been in a game like Hoenn, because in that case, our dad is also a strong trainer, and that would have been like a good parallel. I feel like another idea is just like, there are 5 people in our friend group, including us, and there's 5 scientists in Team Flare, so I feel like that's like a prime opportunity to make each of us a parallel to each other. That way, at each site that Team Flare targets, we can have an emotional beat that helps to define one of our friends' personalities, as well as each scientist, since at this point they're kind of interchangeable. But I'm going to try to move on to like the X and Y rivals individually. This is like a lot of time to spend on just them. Sorry guys. So something I noticed is that like every time Calum and Serena begin to reflect on their failures, they immediately cut themselves off and just like leave the scene. Or I don't know why this is, but I think they should have at least had one scene where they like talk to Shauna in private so they could strengthen their friendship with someone in the group, and then we could also get a sense of where they are emotionally. I'd prefer if the player wasn't part of the conversation, because it feels like there needs to be like a moment of vulnerability between friends, so I guess maybe we can just like stop at the doorway for a cutscene where Caleb and Serena like talk things through with Shauna or whatever, and then we kind of walk in as if we didn't hear anything. On a separate note, I really like Serena's dialogue when she insults Team Flare at the Pokeball Factory. I'm just like, damn, I wish she was this savage all the time. Shauna's only contribution to the plot was like opening a door in Team Flare's HQ using a puzzle-solving device that Clement gave her. I don't even know what a puzzle-solving device entails, but I feel like Shauna should have opened that door herself, or like just not used that, because otherwise Clement may as well have just been there and done it himself. Even Caleb just says, "Wow, not bad, Shauna. Well, Clement was the one who made it, but you brought it here, so I guess both of you are pretty great." Like, that just seems like a clear admission that she didn't really do anything important. Alternatively, since our side quest in Parfum Palace did set up that Shauna likes puzzles, I feel like it might have been nice if we had to open the door together somehow. Like, if there were, like, 2 switches and we had to stand on them simultaneously. Like, wouldn't that have been, like, a better way to incorporate our friend into the story? Whatever. Anyway, Trevor's Pokedex obsession probably would have worked better in Legends Arceus because Pokedex completion is a much bigger deal in those games, and I feel like we could have done a thing where like we compete to fill out certain research tasks but like within a certain time frame, just because that would be a lot more challenging than how Pokedex completion goes in X and Y. Competing to register Pokemon in X and Y doesn't feel nearly as challenging because the information is just passively recorded in the Pokedex. There's no effort from the player outside of tracking the Pokemon in the first place. Or I feel like Trevor was made specifically to fabricate this competition, just so that we would be incentivized to complete the biggest Pokedex to date, but it just feels kind of unnecessary because catching Pokemon and exploring the region is already a core objective of all Pokemon games anyways. This is the last X and Y one. Okay. Tierno should have just waited a generation and been merged with Hau because his dancing obsession meshes way better with Alolan culture than with Colosian culture. None of the features in X and Y have anything to do with dancing, but Sun and Moon has Z moves, which are often compared to dance. Professor Kukui studies Pokemon moves, and Oricorio's main gimmick is literally dancing. Assuming that there'll be X and Y remakes, I think Tierno should be retconned to be Alolan, or at least have like a deep admiration for Alolan culture. Otherwise, he should just make an appearance in Sun and Moon remakes, where Oricorio would be part of his team or something. And if none of those worked out, then he could have at least incorporated one of the features of X and Y into his character, like roller skating, or I don't know, maybe he puts out PR videos like their TikToks. Just something. Like, he could have done something. Or I don't know why he existed in X and Y when he doesn't tie into, like, anything that the games have to offer whatsoever. They should have done something with all of these characters. On a related note, I really wish Tierno didn't waste the concept of a Pokemon dance team because it's such an interesting gimmick to work with. The only dance move that his Groudon and Talonflame know is Swords Dance, and neither of them seem related to dancing at all, but his Roserade's Masquerade elements do tie back to Tierno's theme, but then its only move is Petal Dance, so it's just kind of underwhelming. I appreciate that they form a Grass, Fire, Water core, but he could have easily replaced his Roserade with a Lilligant because it learns Petal Dance, Quiver Dance, and Teeter Dance, and its Western ball gown attire would still kind of fit within the French setting, I think. Volcarona could replace his Talonflame because it has Fiery Dance and Quiver Dance, and there are plenty of dance-adjacent Pokemon, like performance-based Pokemon, that could learn Teeter Dance or Swords Dance, like Mr. Mime, Ludicolo, Spinda, Gallade. He could have also expanded his concept to include sound-based moves, or moves with the word spin in them, like Hitmontop can learn Rapid Spin, for example. But what I'm saying is that he had options. Another way we could have enhanced our rivalry with Hop would be if we were Raihan's sibling instead, and then that way we could carry our brother's feud into like a new generation. Our side of the rivalry would just be fueled by a desire to finally knock Leon down the way that Raihan never could. That's all I have to say about Hop. And then finally, in addition to having more screen time in general, I think Bede should have been given more father-son moments with Chairman Rose so we could have a better understanding of why he's following him. I get that Rose helped Bede when he was in an orphanage, but other than that, I don't get the sense that they have a deep enough connection to warrant this level of loyalty. In fact, all the information about their relationship is only on Bede's league card, And while I've seen a lot of fans praise this form of characterization, to me it feels like very vital information that should have been shown rather than told. But on a related note, it's actually kind of unclear to me whether Rose adopted Bede or just visited him in an orphanage, but if it's the latter case, then I think it's kind of funny, because that just makes me think of Princess Cookie's backstory from Adventure Time. Similarly unclear is what happened to Bede's parents, because saying that his family ran into some trouble could either mean that they died in a car accident or something, or they killed someone in a car accident, which would be kind of funny. Other than that, I think it would have been helpful if Bede could drop some insider knowledge about Eternatus and the purpose of wishing stars. That way his presence in the story would feel a little bit less disposable. Suggestions for future rivals? You know, before I even started the script, I was just thinking about what rival concepts hadn't been done yet. This video wasn't originally going to be so long, but then I kept getting hung up on what it means to be a rival in the first place, and what makes them work before eventually getting out of hand. So after many months of all this nonsense, I can finally make my suggestions for future rivals. Finally! Okay, my first idea was a rival that's ostensibly a nice person, they just say things that could be interpreted as condescending or unintentionally passive-aggressive. Personally, I was just thinking about that clip where someone nicknamed the player character Fucker, and then Sean was just like, say hi to your mom for me, because it perfectly embodies this kind of backhanded mean girl energy that's just kind of entertaining. It's like Clara but on accident. This idea came from that common desire that a lot of fans have, where it's like they just want a rival they can hate. But I wanted to take it in a direction that leaned into the irritation that people have for friendly rivals. For example, how would you feel if there was like a friendly rival that just like, you know, hands you items and heals your Pokemon and stuff, but like every time they do it, they just punctuate it with a phrase that's like, oh, I know you needed this. I like helping the less fortunate. And they're just like dead serious about like, no, yeah, they are actually trying to do this to be helpful. They just keep saying shit that just sounds so insensitive and rude. Or like after losing a battle, they just are like smiling, but they're saying stuff like, you're such a little cheat, aren't you? Did you give your Pokemon some extra vitamins or something? Come on, tell me how you did it. That would feel so like uncomfortable. Or like maybe if they win, they just say something like, oh, that was way easier than I thought it was gonna be. Like, these kinds of comments would sting from a mean person, but hearing them from someone who's genuinely asking is arguably more infuriating, because you know they don't mean to be mean. And because it's unintentional, I feel like this type of rival would be especially resistant to character development in this particular area, and I feel like that would be great for people who love to hate their rivals. Or it sounds borderline masochistic, but like, a lot of people just want this. They want to be insulted, so who am I to deny the people what they want? In a similar vein, I think it would be interesting if we subverted the trope of the, like, friendly, uncompetitive secondary rival and just made them the prickly one instead. This is basically the jerk personality that people want, but attached to the rival that doesn't really care about battling. I assume the writers have kind of just avoided giving this type of personality to that particular character, because it's not really an intuitive step, and it would be kind of hard to explain why a character like this is traveling with the player in the first place, but I feel like it would be kind of an interesting twist on it. Like, maybe early in the game, they're forced to escort us somewhere before we have a Pokemon, and they're, like, really annoyed to do it. But then, like, they meet us more over the course of our journey. And then, like, you know, as we grow into a more competent trainer, they begin to warm up to us. So rather than having a friend character that, like, is immediately supportive, the appeal of this character would be that you, like, naturally develop a friendship, which I guess kind of makes them like a tsundere or something, which is honestly kind of surprising that that archetype hasn't been used given its prevalence in anime. Alternatively, we could apply this abrasive personality to our primary rival, except whenever they lose, they kind of just take on the brattier aspects of Blue's personality, and then they just like throw a tantrum or something. Because jerk rivals are held in such high regard, I get the sense that people want to take them really seriously, but I think it'd be both funny and humanizing if we were reminded that we're literally fighting another 10-year-old. You know, it's like, they pretend to be cool and mature, but at heart they're very sensitive. But then at the same time, since they still treat us poorly, I don't think this would diminish our desire to defeat them in battle. I feel like whether or not this idea is done right kind of just depends on the severity of their abrasiveness, but ideally we should find their breakdowns amusing and not annoying. And then, like, over time they would just kind of mature and eventually learn to respect us like most jerk rivals do. My last original idea for a rival would just be an attention-seeking guy that takes credit for all of our achievements, mainly the ones pertaining to the evil team. This could just mean they include themselves in our success, and they're just like, we did it, or like maybe people just assume that they're responsible and we just never get to clarify that we're the ones who did all the work. But I feel like the most devious and straightforward version of this character would just be someone who takes credit on purpose. So basically, every time we defeat a horde of evil team grunts, this rival would swoop in and claim that they did it. Obviously, this character wouldn't be very pleasant, but once the two of us reached the Pokemon League, we would finally have the chance to prove that we were really the one who took down the evil team by, you know, publicly humiliating them in our final battle, and then we can finally reclaim all the clout we deserve, and in the pettiest way possible. I feel like the common thread in all of these rival ideas is just pettiness. I don't know why, I just feel like that's my way of like trying to weasel out of doing just jerk versus friendly rivals. But I think the main inspiration for this particular idea just came from the fact that like in X and Y, our rivals kind of just like share the stage with us during that parade in Lumio City, and I'm kind of bitter about it because they didn't contribute anything to the Team Flare crisis. And I was just like, what are you doing up there? But on the topic of evil teams, I'd like to review a couple of unexplored character trajectories, starting with what if one of our rivals joined an evil team, and started as part of Team Plasma, and Gladion switched from Team Skull to our side, but we haven't had a rival that transfers from good to evil. This idea is not unique to me, I'm far from the only person that wants this, but it is kind of surprising that the writers haven't done this concept yet, because it feels pretty plausible. It would be especially understandable if the rival in question was the type to get really fed up with repeated losses, and I feel like it could make for some good character drama if they chose the weaker starter. Speaking of which, I'd really like to have more dragons available early in the game, specifically for rivals with weaker starters, because they were literally designed to counter all the other starter types. It just doesn't make sense for them to use their starter as the final and strongest member of their team, when clearly it would be more dramatic if they used something else. Even one of the types that are like completely neutral to the starters would work better as an ace since they lack a distinct type advantage or disadvantage. Caleb and Serena in particular would really benefit from incorporating a fighting dark psychic core into their teams, since one is already built into the Kalos starters as second types, and like the only time they actually achieve this is when they have a chestnut. Hell, maybe our rivals should just forego using a starter at all, and then just base their whole team around a neutral Pokemon like with Wally, because like Psychic is pretty neutral against everything. Another option would be to play around with a core of Ice, Ground, and Electric, since these types are all super effective against the starters, but not resistant to them, so they would still have trouble covering the starters defensively. In fact, collectively they're all weak to the starter types, but since the distribution of those weaknesses is different, I feel like it'd be a little bit more interesting than the typical grass, fire, water core that some rivals rely on for team building. Of course, all of this would be pointless if players had immediate options to deal with these Pokemon, but at the same time, I wouldn't want to punish players by restricting Pokemon variety early on, so I feel like as a compromise, I think it'd be best if more early root Pokemon simply gained or changed types upon evolution. I mean, I guess they kind of do that, but, you know. This could be as drastic as making Eevee an early root Pokemon, but even something like Swablu would be a fitting choice, since Altaria is statistically on par with the more recent regional birds, plus evolving into a dragon type is a nice bonus. It's honestly surprising that something as cutesy as Swablu hasn't been made into an early root Pokemon yet, but before I fall down a rabbit hole of Pokemon availability, I should just, like, get back into talking about rivals instead. So, other than making rivals a part of the evil team, what else could they do? Well, in games with multiple rivals, I suggest that we make our secondary rivals competitive in a completely different arena, like contests or the Pokeathlon. There's no reason we can't have rivals that excel in other forms of competition, and if anything, it offers an alternative path for them that isn't just Pokemon research versus irrelevancy, because that's just kind of what happens when battling is the only thing that they have going for them, and then we beat them and then they're just like, they just don't matter. Perhaps it may seem pointless to spotlight a character whose main purpose is to compete in an optional side mode, but at least then when we do participate in such competitions, it would feature a major character rather than a group of random NPCs, and that added element of familiarity might make these game modes a little bit more approachable, and if that leads players to invest time in learning and mastering the mechanics of the game, then these rivals will have done their job. But for a more story-oriented rival, maybe we could compete to find like the box legendary after a chance encounter at the start of the game. I guess it's kind of like how in Sword and Shield, Hop and the player kind of find Zacian or Zamazenta, but like if that legendary Pokemon was met throughout the game and then we're both trying to find it first and like capture it first, I think that would be kind of an interesting dynamic. This scenario works off the same basic principle as Hugh, Gladion, and N, where the rivals' motivations are intertwined with one of the major storylines, but instead of battling to prove our strength, we'd battle to like test our worthiness to meet the legendary Pokemon or something like that. I feel like this would be an interesting twist on the Pokemon formula, and I feel like with the open world direction that the franchise seems to be taking, perhaps it could even replace the Evil Team storyline, because then we could just travel around the region searching for clues on the legendary's whereabouts instead of, putting a stop to the schemes of these criminals. On the other hand, since the role of legendary Pokemon has largely overshadowed our rivals and the champion in most generations, maybe it'd be better if legendary stories were just moved to the post-game altogether. This might seem like a radical move considering the large role legendaries play in the storytelling and marketing of the main series, but given that there's still a precedent for this in the Gen 1 and 2 games, I wouldn't say it's like super crazy. The only difference would be that newer games would probably craft like a more elaborate post-game story to lead players to the box legendary instead of letting us figure it out for ourselves. In fact, I actually thought Sword and Shield was going to return to this story structure because the core of its narrative was focused on the rivals, Leon, and the gym challenge until, Eternatus got shoehorned into the 11th hour of the story. I still don't fully understand why these games needed an obligatory legendary encounter when Eternatus should have been used for the Dynamaxing crisis in the post-game, because now you just have 2 instances where a bunch of Pokemon are Dynamaxing, and it's like a weird crisis. Like, just put it in the post-game, and then let us focus on our rivalry first. Eternatus' presence in the main story is really just emblematic of the fact that legendaries aren't vital to the structure of the main story, which is kind of ironic considering Eternatus is a skeleton. At least in this case, I really do believe that delaying the legendary plot could have greatly improved the story, because this structure creates a very natural sense of progression for the player from like a small town kid with rivals to the champion, and then a literal legendary trainer. Rivals may not get a big role in this kind of story, but they are at least given the room they need to be active contributors to the story without being dwarfed by a larger presence. Not much else can be said about rivals themselves, but I do have a few suggestions to characterize the player. First of all, we should get more varied dialogue options, because if our choices don't matter anyway, then we may as well have different ways of expressing the same idea. The options won't fundamentally change anything about our rivalries, but, at least then we can have slightly different interactions with them between playthroughs, and then that can it can like define the character dynamic on like a smaller scale. Secondly, the player needs to have more explicit motivations. They don't need to be anything complicated, just something to make the matches with our rival more meaningful. Maybe the champion saved us as a kid, and so we really need to show them how strong we've become, and so we need to like work our way up to that. Perhaps our father was the champion, and we have a family legacy to uphold. Or possibly our mom just comments at the beginning of the game that, hey, you've always admired Pokemon trainers and you're finally becoming one today. Like, that's literally all you need for us to understand like why we're participating in this competition. Our motives can parallel our rivals, or they can be completely unrelated, but whatever the case may be, they need to set up why we care about becoming stronger in the first place, because the most intense rivalries are the ones where both participants have something to lose. Conclusion. So, this was excruciating. I swear, if my next video takes another 6 months to make, I'm going to lose my mind. I was so desperate to finish this before the next semester started that I stopped playing Legends Arceus when vacation began, but like now summer is 2/3 over, so as soon as I get this video out, I'm going back to gaming. I don't want all my videos to leave on a tired note, so I guess the takeaway for my next video, whatever it is that it should be about something far more contained, like a mini-series or like a specific character. I think the only suggestion I have left for the writers is that they should really put more thought into the tropes they're trying to subvert. This applies to every aspect of the franchise, but for Rivals, I'm just hoping that these subversions aren't being made solely to shake things up. That doesn't mean I want the writers to stop experimenting altogether, because they've made friendly rivals that work. They've made multiple rivals that work, and they've made rivals with weaker starters that are Okay, but the focus with these characters should always be on crafting a situation that motivates us to learn about the game so that we can become better at it. There are already a handful of successful rivals that can be looked to as role models, but failing that, for stories that really don't need a rival, I'd prefer that the writers just break tradition by not including one like in Legends Arceus, instead of mindlessly cramming them into the games. But on that note, I still invite all of you to comment your favorite rivals regardless of how competitive they make you feel. Again, I don't want to be a downer on everyone's favorites, so I want you guys to celebrate the rivals that you do like, whether it's because they drive you crazy, or you have nostalgia for them, or because they're just a fun character in general. Even though some of these characters aren't good competitors, it's completely valid to like them for totally different reasons. I mean, my favorite rival is currently Clara, and I wouldn't call her a particularly intimidating competitor. I was already champion when I played through the Isle of Armor, so it's not like I had anything to prove to her, but she's very much like Melly in the sense that it's simply entertaining to see how petty she can get. So whoever you like, sing their praises in the comments. You don't even need to explain why. Lastly, I just want to thank everyone for all the support on my previous video. I immediately got a comment within like a day of posting, which was very sweet. Thank you, Crimson. The video got more attention around February 10-ish, so like it started getting into triple-digit numbers at that point. And then the comment section just really exploded throughout March and April, and I feel like that was my favorite part, because like I wanted to see other people's ideas and feedback, and that's why interacting with the comment section was just my favorite part, because that's what I wanted the most. I think the only thing that people seem to take issue with, and it's not that many people, so don't worry. I think the only problem that people had was basically just like the limitations I set for the cast and episode count, which I agree weren't necessary, but I do kind of want you to keep in mind that I was originally just going to review the season normally until I realized that contextualizing this growing list of alterations would probably be better. And since I was only changing stuff rather than adding things, I guess I just thought like, yeah, I can knock this out in 13 episodes. Not to mention it gave me a sense of how far into the project I was. Like, I wanted to have like a specific idea of how far into the writing process I was, because with this video, I had no idea how far I was because I didn't have like a specific set amount of time or like pre-planned ideas of where exactly it was gonna go. So having an episode limit was definitely for my convenience more than anything else. My current opinion on how All-Stars could have been improved is that the Revenge cast should have had like a second longer season, and then All-Stars would just serve as their third season. Because like, I think some people suggested switching All-Stars and Pacateo Island, but I feel like if we're going to include like all three casts, then that just means that there's one really developed cast and two underdeveloped casts, so I feel like it would be better if the Revenge cast just had more time to be fleshed out a little bit more, and then, you know, some of the characters that didn't make it to the merge could make it to the merge, and then like all the post-merge contestants from both of those seasons could be used in All-Stars, which would logically increase the number of original cast members as well, and then also the number of episodes. But anyway, thank you for watching this video. I'm hoping things are even better than last time. Bye! Oh yeah, I was wondering if someone could make a cover of Boy Shit by Madison Beer, but like using the Pokemon black and white sound font. I know this is kind of an odd request, but I'm only asking now because this is a Pokemon related video, and I don't know when I'll have the opportunity to ask this again. Specifically, I think you could use the trumpets from the beginning of Miss Charlton City's theme, or like the trumpets from Zekrom and Reshiram's theme, to punctuate the first two times she says Boy Shit during the chorus, and then slightly syncopate the rest of the chorus so that it feels a bit more like battle-y. So I guess sort of like if this snap is like a trumpet sound going upward, it would be like doo-doon doon 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 doo-doon doon doo-doon doon 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 doo-doon doon 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 doo-doon doon 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 doo-doon doon 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 doon. So something like that, I guess. It's kind of hard to explain because I don't really understand music well enough. I think I just had this idea because I heard like an 8-bit version of Boy Shit, and I just thought that a version with Generation 5's instrumentation and overall style would make for a dope battle theme, especially because like the bass line very much feels like it could be used in a Pokemon battle theme. So if anything else, just like use that as the basis for like a Pokemon song. I don't know. I feel like there were a couple of other songs that I wanted converted into like a Pokemon sound font for some reason, just because I thought it would be interesting. I think one of them was like I'll Be Your Girl by Carly Rae Jepsen. And then there was also like a different song by Madison Beer, Follow the White Rabbit. I don't really want that one to be converted into a Pokemon sound font, but I did feel like it kind of reminded me of like the Reggie theme for some reason, where it's kind of just this like slow, ominous, portentous sound. I don't even know what portentous means, but it kind of feels like it fits the vibe that I'm trying to describe, where it's just kind of like there's just like this low, empty like area that you're in, and there's just like some notes kind of rumbling upward from there. That's kind of the vibe that that song gives me. If no one wants to do this, I completely understand. It is basically unpaid labor after all, but if anyone does make it, then I would very much appreciate if there was a link to it in the comments. I'm just really curious. Yeah, so this is the actual end of the video. Bye!